Here's the introduction for your YouTube video story. It was supposed to be just another night for Officers Reed and Daniels, patrolling the streets, flexing their authority, and making sure everyone knew who was in charge. They had their routine down to a science, pulling people over, searching them, and sometimes taking a little extra for themselves. A few bills here, a wallet there, who was going to stop them? They had badges after all. That night, they spotted a man walking alone near an upscale neighborhood. He didn't look like he belonged, at least not to them. A black man in an expensive suit, holding a briefcase. That was all the excuse they needed. Sirens flashed, tires screeched, and in seconds, they had him against the car, hands on the hood. No questions, no explanations, just rough hands searching his pockets, taking his wallet, and dumping his briefcase onto the ground. "Where'd you get this kind of money?" Reed sneered, holding up a thick stack of cash. Daniels laughed, shaking his head. "Bet it's not yours." They didn't care who he was, where he was going, or why he was carrying that much money. To them, he was just another guy who wouldn't dare to fight back. Another man forced to swallow his pride as they shoved him around, humiliated him, and made sure he knew exactly where he stood in their world. But there was something different about this one. He didn't plead, didn't beg, didn't even look afraid. Instead, he studied them, calmly, silently, like a man who knew something they didn't. A man who was just waiting. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they sent him on his way. His money, gone. His dignity, stomped into the pavement. Another night, another lesson, taught by Officers Reed and Daniels. They got back into their squad car, laughing, already moving on to the next target. But they had no idea what was coming next. Because that man, the one they had just humiliated, robbed, and left standing on the curb, wasn't just anyone. He was their new boss. The man who, in less than 24 hours, would walk into their precinct, step into the role of police chief, and look them in the eye as they realized exactly who they had messed with. And when that moment came, there would be no sirens to save them, no flashing lights to cover their mistakes, just the weight of their own actions catching up to them in the worst way possible. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with the usual energy, officers filing reports, answering calls, and exchanging stories from the night before. Reed and Daniels strolled in like they owned the place, laughing about their latest lesson. To them, it was just another night, just another guy who wouldn't dare to fight back. As they poured their coffee, a sudden hush swept through the room. One by one, officers straightened up, conversations cut short, and eyes turned toward the entrance. The air felt heavier, charged with something unfamiliar. Then he walked in. The same man they had shoved against the car. The same man they had humiliated, stolen from, and left standing in the dark. But now, he wasn't just another man walking alone at night. He was dressed in full uniform, his badge gleaming under the station lights. His name, Chief Marcus Carter, was embroidered across his chest. Reed's grip tightened around his coffee cup. Daniels felt his stomach drop. The heat that had flushed their faces with arrogance just hours ago had vanished, replaced by something colder, something closer to fear. Chief Carter took his time scanning the room, his eyes lingering just long enough on each officer to make them shift uncomfortably. Then, with the kind of calm that made his presence even more unsettling, he spoke. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "I'm Marcus Carter, your new chief." A few officers nodded, some muttered greetings, but the room still felt tense. His reputation had preceded him, tough but fair, sharp but patient. He wasn't the kind of leader who barked orders. He was the kind who let the weight of silence do the work for him. Then his gaze landed on Reed and Daniels. They stood frozen, trying to play it cool, but Carter saw through them. He could see the way their shoulders tensed, the way Daniels' fingers drummed anxiously against the side of his cup. They knew, and now so did he. Carter didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, he simply smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down their spines. He walked past them, as if dismissing them entirely, but they both knew better. That wasn't the end. That was just the beginning. For the rest of the morning, neither of them could focus. Every time Carter walked by, their stomachs knotted. Every time he spoke, they flinched, half expecting him to call them out in front of everyone. But he didn't. He let them stew in their own nerves, in the uncertainty of what was coming next. Because that was the worst part. Not knowing when, not knowing how, but knowing, without a doubt, that their time was running out. For the next few days, Reed and Daniels felt like they were walking on thin ice. Every step, every word, every sideways glance from Chief Carter made them wonder if this was the moment he would finally call them out. But he didn't. Instead, he played the long game. At meetings, he addressed the department with confidence, laying out his vision for a cleaner, more accountable force. He spoke about integrity, about regaining the trust of the community. His words sounded like they were aimed at everyone, but Reed and Daniels knew better. They felt the weight of every sentence. And then Carter started asking questions. He wasn't aggressive about it. He was patient, methodical. He pulled up old reports, reviewed body cam footage, and sat in on ride-alongs. He watched how officers handled themselves, how they treated the people they swore to protect. And the more he observed, the more he saw the cracks in the system. Officers who looked the other way, reports that didn't quite add up, a culture of silence that had been growing for years. Reed and Daniels knew they were under a microscope. They did their best to act normal, but it wasn't easy. The paranoia was getting to them. Every time Carter spoke to another officer in private, they wondered if someone had talked. Every time they passed by his office and saw the door closed, they feared what was being discussed behind it. One night, Daniels couldn't take it anymore. He pulled Reed aside in the locker room, making sure no one else was around. "We need to do something," he hissed. "He's onto us." Reed exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "We don't know that." Daniels shook his head. "Are you serious? The way he looks at us. The way he keeps digging. He knows, Reed. It's just a matter of time before he takes us down." Reed leaned against the lockers, jaw tight. He had always been the one in control, always the one calling the shots. But now, for the first time, he felt trapped. "What do you suggest?" he muttered. Daniels hesitated before lowering his voice even more. "We get ahead of this. We spin it before he does." Reed frowned. "How?" Daniels glanced around again, then leaned in. "We flip the story. We make it seem like he's the problem, that he's got an agenda against us, a personal vendetta." Reed narrowed his eyes. It was risky, but if it worked, it could save them. If they could make Carter look biased, turn the department against him, maybe, just maybe, they could get out of this. But what they didn't know was that Carter was already 10 steps ahead. And their desperate plan, it was only going to make things worse. The tension inside the precinct was suffocating. Reed and Daniels carried themselves with forced confidence, but underneath it, they were unraveling. Every shift felt like a countdown, every interaction with Chief Carter a silent battle. They needed to act fast. It started subtly, whispers in the break room, side comments to officers they knew were easily influenced. They painted Carter as an outsider, someone who didn't understand how things worked, someone trying to clean up a mess that wasn't really there. They hinted at favoritism, questioned why he was suddenly so focused on them. They didn't need to say much, just enough to plant the seed of doubt. But Carter saw it happening. He heard the murmurs, the way certain officers suddenly hesitated when speaking to him, the way the usual cliques closed ranks. It didn't rattle him. If anything, it confirmed what he already knew. Reed and Daniels were desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. Then came the breaking point. Late one evening, Carter sat in his office reviewing old case files. Something didn't sit right with him. Patterns were forming, arrests with missing evidence, reports that contradicted witness statements, complaints that had been quietly dismissed. He had enough to launch an internal investigation, but he wasn't ready to move just yet. He wanted them to expose themselves further. And they did. Reed and Daniels, knowing their time was running out, took one final risk. They pulled strings, reached out to an old connection in the department, someone with influence. An anonymous tip was filed, an accusation that Carter had tampered with evidence in a past case. It was flimsy, built on nothing, but they didn't need proof. They just needed doubt. Enough to slow him down, enough to make people question his leadership. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. Rumors spread fast, officers whispering in corners, exchanging glances when Carter walked by. He could feel the shift, the undercurrent of uncertainty. But what Reed and Daniels didn't know was that Carter had already anticipated this move. Because while they were busy trying to frame him, they hadn't realized they were the ones being watched. Carter had quietly reopened an internal affairs case, one that involved complaints against Reed and Daniels. He had pulled security footage, cross-checked reports, and spoken to officers who had long been afraid to come forward. And then there was the missing money, the cash they had taken from him that night. They thought they had buried that mistake, but Carter had documented every dollar. Now it was all coming together. Reed and Daniels thought they were playing chess, but Carter had already put them in checkmate. And they were about to find out just how badly they had lost. The precinct felt different now. The same officers who once whispered about Carter were watching Reed and Daniels instead. The shift was subtle, but it was there, the stolen glances, the quick exchanges that stopped when they walked by. Something was changing, and they could feel it. Then came the moment they had been dreading. Carter called for an all-hands meeting. Officers filed into the briefing room, filling the rows with an energy that was tense and uncertain. Reed and Daniels sat stiffly in their usual spots, trying to act unfazed, but their palms were sweating. Something was coming. Carter stood at the front, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. In this department, we don't just enforce the law, we're supposed to uphold it. His eyes swept the room, landing on different faces, making sure every word sank in. But sometimes, the people who wear this badge forget what it stands for. Reed swallowed hard. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. I've been reviewing past cases, Carter continued, looking at inconsistencies, evidence that's gone missing, complaints that were never followed up on. He paused, letting the silence stretch. And what I've found is disturbing. Murmurs spread through the room. Officers exchanged glances, some uneasy, others expectant. Carter let the tension build before he spoke again. Effective immediately, an internal investigation is being launched. No more buried complaints. No more unanswered questions. His gaze locked onto Reed and Daniels. No more silence. Daniels clenched his jaw, trying to keep his breathing steady. This wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. But before either of them could react, the real shock hit. The door to the briefing room swung open. Two men in dark suits stepped inside. Internal affairs. The moment their badges flashed, the room shifted. Officers who had once stood by Reed and Daniels suddenly looked away. The silence was deafening. Reed's pulse pounded. This wasn't just a routine investigation. This was something else, something bigger. Then Carter spoke again, his voice even deliberate. I've given them full access to every record, every report, every piece of missing evidence. His eyes never left them. And anyone found guilty of misconduct will be held accountable. Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, one of the internal affairs officers stepped forward. Officers Reed and Daniels, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. We need to have a word. The room was silent. The walls felt like they were closing in. This was it. The trap had been set. And now it was snapping shut. Reed and Daniels felt every eye in the room on them. The weight of the moment pressed against their chests as the internal affairs officers stood waiting. For a split second, Reed considered standing up and demanding answers, trying to turn the tables. But deep down, he knew there was no way out of this. Daniels was the first to move. He pushed back his chair, his hands balled into fists, but his usual arrogance was gone. Instead, there was only panic. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice shaking. "We've done nothing wrong." Carter stays silent, watching. "Let's talk outside," one of the internal affairs officers said, his tone firm. Reed and Daniels had no choice but to follow. The walk through the precinct was the longest of their lives. Officers who once laughed at their jokes now looked away. The ones who had feared them now stood taller. Reed felt his pulse hammering in his ears. How had it come to this? They were led into a private office, the blinds drawn. A thick folder sat on the desk, filled with reports, complaints, and, worst of all, evidence, footage of them shaking down civilians, falsifying reports, pocketing cash. Every misstep, every moment they thought had gone unnoticed was right there in black and white. Daniels broke first. "Look, we can explain." One of the investigators cut him off. "Save it. We already know." Reed clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This was over. Everything they had built, the power, the fear, the untouchable reputation, was crumbling right in front of them. Then Carter stepped inside. He stood by the door, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch before he spoke. "It's funny," he said slowly. "The two of you thought you could take what wasn't yours, push people around, and never face the consequences." His eyes flicked to the folder. "But the truth has a way of coming out." Reed's temper snapped. "You set us up," he hissed. "You planned this from the start." Carter tilted his head. "No," he said. "You did this to yourselves." Daniels was breathing heavily, his face pale. "What happens now?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. One of the investigators closed the folder. "You know what happens." For the first time, Reed had no response. No excuse, no way out. But just when it seemed like this was the end, Carter took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Here's the part you didn't see coming," he said. "This isn't just about you two. We've got names. Officers who looked the other way. Supervisors who let things slide. This entire department is getting cleaned up." Reed's stomach dropped. It wasn't just about them. This was bigger than they ever imagined. And the worst part, there was nothing they could do to stop it. The news spread fast. By the next morning, Reed and Daniels were off the force, their badges and guns confiscated, their names attached to one of the biggest scandals the department had seen in years. The same officers who once followed their lead now avoided even saying their names. They were ghosts, reminders of a broken system that was finally being exposed. Carter didn't stop there. With internal affairs digging deeper, more names surfaced. Officers who had covered for them, supervisors who had ignored complaints. The department was getting a full sweep, and this time there was no hiding from accountability. The city, tired of corruption, demanded justice. But for Carter, it wasn't just about getting rid of the bad apples. It was about rebuilding trust. He started with a community, meeting with people who had lost faith in the badge, listening to stories of mistreatment and broken promises. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but every honest conversation, every effort to repair the damage, was a step in the right direction. One evening, as he walked out of the station, he saw a familiar face waiting outside. It was the young man Reed and Daniels had humiliated that night, the moment that had set everything in motion. They locked eyes, and for a second, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, the young man gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was something. Acknowledgement. A sign that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Carter nodded back, then watched as the man walked away, blending into the city that still had so much healing to do. As Carter turned toward his car, he knew there was still a long road ahead. Corruption didn't disappear overnight. But this was a start, a reminder that power,